Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research focuses on the intellectual history of the US Constitution and how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better understand and address contemporary social and political issues. Now, today, what I'd like to chat about is voting, the fundamental, concrete way that we add our voices to that conversation about how we want to govern ourselves that also legitimates government. Particularly, I want to discuss what happens when we start to decide who gets a voice and who doesn't. And I want to do so in the context of this historical tension between hierarchy and equality. Now, what raises this topic is the Supreme Court ruling that essentially overturned the little that was left of the Voting Rights Act and how Southern states have responded to this ruling. They've taken this ruling as an opportunity to redraw districts and redraw them in a way that breaks up historically Black communities in such a way that these voters would have their voice diluted. They wouldn't get their own representative in the federal government. So essentially, what the Voting Rights Act was put in place to prevent. And the justification by politicians and even the justices on the Supreme Court that as a society we've moved beyond it is simply gaslighting. And we can see this by the speed at which these states initiated this redistricting process and their precise targeting on these Black communities that had been protected by the Voting Rights Act. So, what this repeal and the states' response is effectively doing is reimposing a hierarchical, repressive, and regressive ideology on different communities throughout the United States and justifying it as equality, liberty, and a sign of our progress as a nation and community. It's gaslighting. However, to better understand what's going on here and how we can respond to it, we're going to look at the founding and the founders' thoughts about voting rights, liberty, and who gets a voice and how we govern ourselves, as well as the historical context that reveals this ongoing tension between equality and hierarchy that I argue colors much of American history. We've discussed the founders' views on liberty and voting multiple times on this channel. Particularly, I argued that we the people essentially means everybody gets a say in how we govern ourselves. This is liberty, and one of the most fundamental, concrete ways we add our voice to the collective conversation about how we govern ourselves is through the vote. We've discussed that there are other ways as well, such as through the press and through protest, but voting is the most fundamental and the way that we legitimate the government. We consent to being governed by this government because we voted for it. And we see this reaffirmed, or at least implied, in the last words of our Pledge of Allegiance: liberty and justice for all. Liberty is the right to govern oneself, to have a say in how you're governed. And how we govern ourselves is through law, which is our collective decision on what's just and unjust, what we can do and what we can't do. And the all part is meant to refer to equality. So we all get a say in the laws that we govern ourselves by, liberty and justice for all. And at least one of our founders took this a step further and really dug into what do we mean by representation. And unsurprisingly, that founder is none other than James Wilson. At the Constitutional Convention, James Madison records a very insightful description of representation that Wilson provides, which I'm going to read to you in full. The quotation goes, "He, James Wilson, wished for vigor in the government, but he wished that vigorous authority to flow immediately from the legitimate source of all authority." What he's referring to here is we the people. The quote continues, "The government ought to possess not only first the force, but secondly, the mind or sense of the people at large. The legislature ought to be the most exact transcript of the whole society." And I find that last bit of the quotation particularly pertinent to the Voting Rights Act. The legislature ought to be as an exact a transcript as possible of the whole society. Essentially, that our representatives should actually represent us, not only in our ideas and what we're for, but they should look like us. They should represent our demographics and our different experience of America and Americanness. This can feel and look very different for different populations within the United States. And our representation, our legislature, should reflect those differences. And this is what the Voting Rights Act was meant to accomplish, that everyone could have a voice, particularly at the federal government. Now, when it came to implementing these founding ideals of equality, liberty, and justice, the founders left more than a bit to be desired. We've also discussed this in previous chats, but at the time of the founding, it was largely white men, and particularly white men with property, who were allowed to vote. Now, they did expand the franchise, who gets to vote, dramatically compared to Britain at the time. And even when it came to ratifying the Constitution, many of the states lowered the bar for who got to vote. It was closer to a universal white male suffrage. However, even though this was a big step, many at the time even recognized the hypocrisy of declaring equality and liberty as an inalienable human right, and at the same time denying that liberty, that right to participate and decide on how you're governed, to large groups of the population. For instance, as I've mentioned before, William Whipple signs the Declaration of Independence and frees his slaves because he recognizes the hypocrisy. He says, "I cannot at once sign a document that declares that all men are born free and equal while holding others in bondage." And interestingly, both George Washington and Benjamin Franklin recognized this hypocrisy, act upon it, and also recognize that this hypocrisy is an existential threat to the fledgling nation. Now, it took George Washington quite a while to finally recognize this hypocrisy and threat, and he spends much of the end of his life saving up money and making plans as to how to free his slaves after his death in his will. Alternatively, Benjamin Franklin frees his slaves much earlier and eventually becomes the president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. And one of his final public acts is writing a letter to the U.S. Congress advocating for doing everything they could to abolish the institution of slavery. Now, what Washington and Franklin both realized is that hypocrisy at this foundational level threatened the entire structure built upon it. Who would buy into the ideal of America and work for its common good if there was this hypocrisy built in at its roots? Why would anyone trust this ideal and these promises? Alternatively, people recognize that this enslaved population and oppressed group might one day also revolt, have their own revolution, and claim their inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And potentially not only claim their liberty, but also take vengeance on those who had ruled over them tyrannically. This fear of a slave revolt motivated much of the South's political position throughout the founding and up to the Civil War. They consistently supported policies and structures that protected the institution of slavery, and in doing so, prevent the potential for a slave revolt, which would not only threaten their way of life, but also their very lives. For the South, and particularly the Southern elite planters and their political representatives, abolishing slavery was an existential threat. For instance, this motivates the Three-Fifths Compromise at the Constitutional Convention. The Southern delegates want their slaves counted in the census when it comes to representation so that they would get more representatives in the House and more electoral votes for president. They essentially would rig the elections in their favor so they could never lose. And at the same time, they had no intention of letting their slaves, who they considered their property, vote. Now, the Northern delegates called this out and said, you can't at once treat these people as property and count them as people that should be represented in our government. You have to pick one. And many of them wanted them to pick abolition. If you want these votes, you have to free your slaves. Now, this was a non-starter for the Southern delegates. And eventually we arrive at the Three-Fifths Compromise. When James Wilson is presenting this to the people of Pennsylvania, he recognizes that it's not what they wanted, nor what justice demands. However, the choice before him was maintaining the Union by accepting the Three-Fifths Compromise or allowing it to fracture. And Wilson recognized that if the Union was maintained, it allowed the opportunity for this institution to eventually be abolished through law, that the northern states and free states would eventually become prosperous enough and populated enough that they could overrule the southern delegates. Now, this might seem like a rationalization for allowing the Three-Fifths Compromise, but many people at the time, including Franklin, were looking for ways to end this morally abhorrent and tyrannical institution without bloodshed. But as we know from history, it did require bloodshed for these legal avenues to finally be taken. It's not until the Civil War that we get the Emancipation Proclamation, as well as the Reconstruction Amendments. However, while these amendments and the Civil War ended the institution of slavery and gave Black men the right to vote, it did not address the underlying hierarchical and dehumanizing ideology that supported the institution of slavery and allowed it to thrive. We never had our truth and reconciliation like South Africa did. Essentially, we gave Black men the right to vote, we pardoned Confederates, and said, let's reunify and forget all of this ever happened. And as W.E.B. Du Bois points out, that did not go particularly well. Now, we can see this quintessentially hierarchical ideology in the institution of slavery quite clearly. We have some elite planters or lords who have their own fiefdoms and serfs or slaves that they inherited from their fathers and grandfathers. Alternatively, especially in chattel slavery, people are born into slavery and servitude. We essentially have something akin to the feudal system in the institution of slavery. Now, hierarchical ideologies and the social orders they create have to be accepted and bought into by the general population. The general population has to venerate or at least respect those elite people on the top. And they normally justify it by dehumanizing those below them, creating an othered out group that is demonized and dehumanized and looked down upon. And this is what tends to lead to the acceptance of this hierarchical order. There is this desire that maybe one day you too could rise to the top of the hierarchy, and you can feel superior in the meantime because you're not one of those dehumanized others. It allows you to belong to this superior group. And in belonging to the superior group, you get to look down on the inferior group. And this combination of belonging and superiority is really enticing to people. It's what many of our fictional warnings about fascism miss. Normally, when fascists are depicted in our novels and movies, they're seen as miserable and scared and horrible. You know, who would ever want to be a Death Eater or a Sith Lord or a Stormtrooper? Nobody wants to be one of those guys, not just because they're morally abhorrent, but doesn't look like a lot of fun. But that's not what fascism looks like or feels like on the inside. On the inside, you feel like part of the superior group. You are good. You're the best. You're better than everybody else, particularly that other group. And you are so because you naturally belong to this group. You were born into it based on your race or your religion or your nationality. It feels good to be in the in-group, particularly in the fascist in-group with the ideology that surrounds it as well as the propaganda. And this is why we see so many in the South at the founding and afterwards buying into this hierarchy, whether or not they were directly benefiting from it or not. It allowed them to feel superior and belong, and gave them somebody to look down upon and say, at least I'm not them. And that's a powerful motive. In creating this hierarchical ideology, it's normally supported and accompanied by a tribal epistemology, which we've talked about often on this channel, where essentially belonging is determined by belief and belief is determined by belonging. So by believing in this hierarchy, you get to identify as part of the superior group, or in this instance, the superior race. Now, in the South, this epistemology was reinforced through law. So when it came to federal politics, most of the Southern delegates believed that The very issue of slavery could not be discussed. When Franklin sends his letter to the Congress, the outrage and pearl clutching by these Southern delegates is absurd. They are offended and outraged that Franklin would even suggest that we might do something to start addressing this horrific institution. Moreover, in the South, long before the Civil War, pro-abolitionist writings, literature, articles were censored and even criminalized. Again, this was this great fear of potentially a slave revolt. If some slaves found this and knew that there were people advocating for their freedom, it might encourage them to rise up on their own. And those in the South also provided their own evidence that supported this hierarchical ideology. Their ministers interpreted the Bible in such a way as to justify the institution of slavery, and they even had their own scientist who looked into proving or explaining and describing the hierarchy of the racial structure, which, while ridiculous and absurd, were believed and incredibly dehumanizing. So we can see the tribal epistemology and the hierarchical ideology being supported by both censoring opposition and creating their own internal epistemological framework and experts that justify their position both in terms of religion and in terms of science. And this ideology and epistemology, as I mentioned earlier, did not end with the Civil War. The South lost the war, but as many scholars argue, they won the peace. And that's because we didn't address this underlying ideology and epistemology that supports a hierarchical understanding of society. Now, I would argue we can understand a lot of American history as this ongoing tension and back and forth between equality on the one hand and hierarchy on the other. So our founders fight a revolution for equality and liberty. Granted, it's only for them, but those are the ideals. And many in US history have worked to further those ideals by extending liberty and equality to more people and in more ways. We have the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Reconstruction Acts. We have the 19th Amendment that grants women the right to vote. We have civil rights legislation, including the Voting Rights Act, that helped us realize that equality and liberty in practice. And in doing so, realize the founding ideal and duty to fix and improve what our ancestors and the founders had left us in terms of the US Constitution and the governmental structure it creates. However, on the other side, we have the institution of slavery in the South that becomes more and more retrenched. We have the Confederacy. We have segregation and the Jim Crow South that continually tries to reimpose a hierarchical order on society where we have some good people at the top all the way down to a dehumanized and demonized other at the bottom. And this is an ongoing tension both in American culture and politics. And we can even see it in the 1980s in the neoconservative movement that designated the Black community this criminal underclass that didn't have a fully developed moral sense and so weren't truly American because they had been corrupted by social programs that made them dependent or something of that variety. You can see it's this same hierarchical ordering in the neoconservative sense. Those who work hard, those who make a lot of money are at the top of the hierarchy. They're venerated. They're aspired to. You too can make it to the top of the hierarchy. Well, we have those on social programs, and particularly the Black community, that's demonized at the bottom. And as we discussed in an earlier chat, this current political movement, epitomized in the current administration, is actually a synthesis of many of these different hierarchical ideologies that have existed throughout American history. We have the techno-fascists that see a hierarchy in economic scale. We see Christian nationalism that does it in religion. We also have the rise of the manosphere and toxic masculinity that is a gender hierarchy. And we have the old school racial hierarchy in the ethno-nationalists or ethno-fascists in terms of Stephen Miller and essentially his war on brown people. And now we have it in the Supreme Court's gutting of the last shreds of the Voting Rights Act. And an easy way to see this tension between hierarchy and equality is how we view the American dream. Is it the white picket fence or is it a mansion? Is it rising to the top of the hierarchy or living well in a community of equals? Now, I've often heard Americans described as all being temporarily embarrassed millionaires. We all identify with the top of the hierarchy. And arguably, that has become the American dream, not creating an equal society, a community where people work hard to realize a good life for themselves and their family, but rather as the opportunity to not just climb up from the working class to the middle class, but to be that millionaire or billionaire at the top who can do whatever they want because the laws don't really apply to them. And so, with that idea of us all being temporarily embarrassed millionaires seeking to rise to the top of that hierarchy, we can see that the Southern ideology won the peace. I mean, we can also see it in the Confederate monuments, the Confederate flags, the schools and military bases named after Confederates, and this recent overturning of the Voting Rights Act and Southern states immediately doing exactly what it prevented them from doing. We can see that the South, or at least this hierarchical ideology that underpinned the Southern way of life and the Confederacy, did win the peace in many ways. So how do we respond to all this? Well, part of it is recognizing this tension and understanding what side of it we want to be on. Particularly, we can respond by leaning into our foundational ideals and principles of equality, liberty, and justice, and really trying to make good on those promises by extending liberty to more people in more ways. And this aligns with our founders' ideals of taking up that duty of advanced citizenship, of fixing and improving what they left us. And many of them recognized, and particularly Washington and Franklin recognized, that one of the foundational errors baked into our system is the institution of slavery and the hierarchical ideology that it perpetuated, which threatened to undermine the very idea of the United States. And we can take up this duty by going out and voting and helping other people vote through volunteering to help people register to vote and volunteering at the polls. These might sound like small things, but facilitating the democratic process as a volunteer poll worker or volunteering to help people register is actively upholding this promise, helping people contribute their voice to our collective conversation about how we want to be governed through voting for our representatives, referendums, and laws. This is how we uphold that principle and value of equality. And what helping everybody have a voice and get out and vote actually does as well is make sure that the numbers are high, so that if we as Americans all come out and collectively say, we are for equality, we are for liberty, and we are against what this administration is doing, it will really count. It will be a resounding assertion by us collectively that America and Americanness really stands for liberty, equality, and justice. And particularly if we can do so in the face of these continuing attempts to rig the election in favor of those who support the current administration, the current regime, this assertion becomes even louder and filters into our culture and begins to really push back and finally address that underlying hierarchical ideology, because it will be all of us collectively saying at once, we choose equality, not hierarchy. And it might sound like an overwhelming task. Experts believed that the Hungarian people could never oust their authoritarian leader. He had rigged the system too much. But they did just this past year, and Americans can as well, and reassert those founding ideals and try to make good on them. And it comes down to all of us making a choice, that choice between whether we're on the side of equality or hierarchy. And when we put it in those terms, it sounds very simple. However, this choice between hierarchy and equality is almost never explicitly given or presented. The ideology of hierarchy is always camouflaged through propaganda and normally a tribal epistemology that lures people in with a promise of superiority and belonging, as well as fear of a dehumanized other group and potentially becoming a part of it, or being subject to its vengeance. Similarly, propaganda is used to disorient people and present alternative facts that reinforce this hierarchical ideology as just natural and justifiable, or even moral when it comes to using religious texts and twisting them. So those beholden to this hierarchical ideology are rarely aware of it. So part of how we address it is by making that choice explicit. And now, if you made it this far, and that choice has been made explicitly to you, what will you choose? And how will you choose to respond to this moment? And for now, I'll leave you to ponder that. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting and educational, or at least helpful. I really appreciate the likes, comments, and subscriptions. They keep me encouraged and help get this information out to an ever broader group of people. And if you like this content, there are a lot more videos on my Substack and YouTube channel. And if you subscribe, you'll get regular updates. Also, I always put out a weekly essay that covers the same topic, but does so in a more structured and detailed method. So if you found this interesting, but some of the points weren't as clear as you would have liked, feel free to take a look at the essay. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.